All right, we're going to continue with the second half of chapter 20. So we're talking now specifically about scientism, which again is the belief that science and empirical study is the only way we can learn knowledge. And we're talking about two things in sections 3 and 4. First of all, how scientism is a faulty way of living, how we cannot really live consistently with that idea. And then in section 4, we'll talk about how scientism is a faulty way of knowing, how you cannot really know anything about the world around you when you base your beliefs on scientism. So first of all, a faulty way of living. It starts off this section 3 talking about the fact that those who believe in scientism don't really have any point for living. It quotes someone named Elizabeth Colbert, who talks about most of us would prefer to believe that our lives have a higher purpose than those of E. coli. The very capacity to aspire, truth, beauty, fame, fortune, intimacy, immortality, that's one of the characteristics that set modern humans apart from other species. But she says that that's really an error to think that humans are special in any way, and that especially that we have any purpose. It talks about how really the only purpose we have is to send on our DNA to the next generation. That's how evolution has designed us. The only way evolution works is by doing whatever it takes to send the DNA to the next generation. And she basically goes on to say that the wisest thing we can do is just to make peace with our pointlessness. And basically, we are pointless. So you can see there a quote by Tolstoy, the only absolute knowledge attainable by man is that life is meaningless. The only thing that we can really know for sure, according to evolution, is that our life is meaningless. So they go on to say, another writer, Lawrence Cross, he says that the two lessons that he wants to give everyone is that we are more insignificant than you ever thought, and that the future is miserable. So two great encouraging truths, that we're more insignificant than we ever thought and that the future is miserable. And yet he says these two things should make us happy, not sad. How in the world could that be? Well, he basically says we should rejoice that, first of all of these accidents have brought us into existence, and by this incredible stroke of good luck, we even exist. And then it's amazing that we then got consciousness, therefore we can make our own meaning. And he says that it should make us happy because we don't have to get our meaning outside of ourselves. We can make our own meaning. And because we can make our own meaning, we are free from religion, and we don't have to worry about a God giving us meaning and therefore telling us what to do. We can do whatever we want to do, and we can make our life mean whatever we want it to mean, which really just means we don't have any meaning. So evolutionists many times call us significance junkies. We talked at the very beginning of the book, a lot of this section will be a review from the beginning of the book, about how evolutionists believe when we try to find significance, it's pointless. So if we get saved from an incredible accident and we miraculously survive, we shouldn't try to find any significance in that. Yet Ecclesiastes 3:11 tells us why we want significance so much. Evolutionists really don't have a reason why we would care about significance. But God tells us why we would need significance. It says in Ecclesiastes 3:11, He has made everything beautiful in its time. Also, He has put eternity in their hearts, except that no one can find out the work that God does from beginning to end. The reason why we are so desperate to find significance in our lives is because that's the way God created us. God created us for something more than just to pass on our DNA to the next generation. We were created for something much greater, and that's why our hearts know that and long for that. Naturalistic morality then says not only do we not have any meaning, but really we don't have any reason to be quote-unquote good, because there is no such thing as good. Some Christians want to say that for that reason, all atheists are going to be evil, and they're just going to do everything that's evil. But in real life, that's not true. And really, that makes sense biblically speaking, because like we talked about in previous chapters with God's common grace, even atheists are still made in God's image. And even though they reject God, God's image is still in them. God's Spirit is still influencing them, so that they still have that conscience. They still know what is right is wrong, and they still sometimes want to do what's right. So we should expect atheists to sometimes do nice things. In fact, many times do really nice, good things, and that's what is true. So we shouldn't make that false accusation that all atheists are the most evil people in the world. Atheists can do good things, at least externally they can appear to be good, even though we know that spiritually, biblically speaking, since they do it for the wrong motivation, from a wrong heart, it is not good in God's sight. But they can do things that help other people, and they do all the time. But even though they can do good, our point is not that they can do good. Our point is that they have no reason to do good. From an atheistic perspective, there is really no reason to be good. Scientism, one of the biggest problems with scientism is they have an is-ought problem. A lot of people who believe in scientism say that because most people believe killing is wrong, therefore we shouldn't kill. So what we see there that is how it ought to be. The problem with that is there are a lot of things that we say should not be. So for example, in nature, you can see on the side there, red in tooth and claw. That's a quote from a poem by Tennyson. And in nature, it's full of rape, murder, it's full of thievery and deceit. And should we be like that because that's how nature is? Should humans, since humans rape each other, is that how we should be? Since humans steal from each other and are evil to each other, is that how we ought to be? All science can tell us is how things are. It cannot tell us how things should be. It can tell us, for example, that a female black widow will eat her mate after they mate. But it can't tell us whether or not a human should eat their mate after they mate. It can just tell us what is. It cannot tell us what ought to be. So it can only tell us what is, not what it ought to be. You can never get absolute morality without an absolute authority. Science is not an authority. Science is simply our observations and our conclusions about those observations. Science can simply tell us what is. It cannot tell us what we should do or what we should not do. So we need a higher authority to tell us what we should do and what we should not do. And in the long run, scientism ends up being very deterministic and fatalistic. Listen to this quote. It says, "It doesn't make sense to call anything in this world right or wrong if we are all random atom collections. What does it matter if I hate my sister, or I ate all your candy, or I love porn? So what? That's just what protoplasm does at this elevation above sea level." Really, if evolution is true, we are just material. We are just a random collection of atoms that has collected in the best way possible to be able to pass down its DNA. Therefore, everything that we do is determined by simply how our atoms are collected and how those atoms respond to their environment around them. So there was no point in saying that murder is wrong. That's just what atoms do in response to an environment around them when they need a certain resource or when they desire something. You can't say that that is good or bad. And really, you can't even say that we can decide for ourselves. Really, we're just completely products of our environment. That's what deterministic or fatalistic means. It means everything is already predetermined. We are just machines, and we're just living in light of what we were programmed by nature to do and how our programming responds to our environment around us. It gives a good illustration on page 312 by the novel about what would happen if humans were robots, and you can read that. So really, we are just programmed that way by evolution. Now, it's interesting that a lot of evolutionists of the past have actually promoted morality and have said we should be nice to one another and we should help humanity. And since we don't have a meaning, we can make our own meaning by helping future generations. And some of them are the strongest promoters of, for example, not polluting the earth or fighting against global warming or helping those that are in slavery. And they're promoting these good ideas, but really they don't have any reason to promote those ideas. Like the thing says there, all thunder comes from on high. Some people, like Friedrich Nietzsche, mispronounced that name, but the famous philosopher who promoted what's called the nihilism, came to the right conclusion, or at least the correct conclusion, the logical conclusion of evolution, when he said, what is good? All that increases the feeling of power, will to power, power itself in man. Again, according to evolution, what's good is what helps us survive, what makes us the most fit. So there is no reason to promote good, to preach for good. So we can be thankful that atheists are inconsistent, that they don't all go the way of nihilism, that they do try to do what's right and even encourage people to do what's right. But if they were truly consistent, like Friedrich Nietzsche, they would be nihilists that believe that simply a will to power that crushes anyone in its way, that's the only true good. So consistent atheism doesn't produce moral crusades. Again, that doesn't mean that atheists are consistent, because they are not. That is why they do have moral crusades. But logically speaking, they have no reason to have those moral crusades, because all thunder, all preaching, we could say, or promoting goodness in the world must come from a higher authority than ourselves that says this is right or that this is wrong. So when an atheist does thunder about some injustice in the world, he's really standing in the boots of forefathers who knew that all thunder comes from on high. He's really stealing that idea that there is wrong and right from the Christian worldview, even though he does not want it. So without theism, there is no absolutes. If morality is an absolute, what is it? Well, again, people like Richard Dawkins would agree that morality is not absolute, and he would simply say that it is, everyone can make their own morality. So whatever the group believes, that's what is moral. So it's whatever people more or less agree to. The problem with that, again, is what happens to the minority group? What happens to the Jews in Germany? What happens to the African slaves in America in the 17 and 1800s? What happens to the minorities right now in China that are being persecuted, or in other countries like that? What happens to the minority group if it's just whatever the majority believes is right? Christianity, on the other hand, offers true conversion. True conversion is submitting to an absolute authority in your life, realizing that God is my authority. I cannot make my own meaning. God has set my meaning. God has set what is right and wrong, and only by accepting Christ can I be truly converted and be completely remade to get freedom from sin. For an atheist, the only promise that they have is that unbelief will remake someone and free him from quote-unquote sin by changing what sin is. Sin is simply whatever I don't like, or whatever the majority doesn't agree with at that time. So the first thing we saw is that atheism and naturalism brings a false way of living. You cannot really live consistently with that way. But it also brings a false way of thinking. The picture here is of the guy that the book discusses at the beginning, John Nash, who was a brilliant mathematician. He had his PhD from Princeton in 1950. He wrote his dissertation in game theory, which is an incredibly difficult field. And then about 45 years later, in 1994, he won a Nobel Prize for mathematics. But in between, he actually spent a significant amount of time in an insane asylum. He was schizophrenic. He thought that the whole world was attacking him. And it was interesting, after he came out of that and became sane again, this is what he said. He said, people are always selling the idea that people who have mental illness are suffering. But it's really not that simple. I think mental illness or madness can be an escape also. If things are not so good, you maybe want to imagine something better. In madness, I thought I was the most important person of the world, and people like the Pope would be just like enemies who would try to put me down in some way. So what he's saying here is that some people choose to not believe certain things because they don't like those things, and it's really what he calls a refuge from the truth. We see this in different passages in the Bible. In Psalm 14 and in verse 1, one of the more famous verses, the psalmist says, "The fool has said in his heart, there is no God." The foolish person decides beforehand that he doesn't want to believe in God. And sometimes that can seem to work out well for people. In Psalm 37 and verse 35, it says, "I have seen the wicked in great power, and spreading himself like a native green tree." In Psalm 73, the psalmist is basically complaining to God because the wicked seem to be prospering. So how can that be if they're believing something that is false? Well, really, madness can be a refuge from the truth. The God denier lives in an irrational world that gives him more temporary pleasure than the real world. A lot of people go mad because their circumstances are so bad they don't want to believe that their circumstances are real, so they start believing the lies that their circumstances aren't real, and they start living in a fake world. That's what happened to Nash. And many times people in a much lesser way can believe things that are wrong simply because they don't want to believe that truth. And for a while that can bring them more pleasure than believing the truth when they don't want to submit to it. So even like Nash, when he was crazy, he still knew a lot of things. He still knew things like the fact that he could still speak English, he could still eat and drink, he still knew there was a person called the Pope, and he still even had some of that mathematical skill. But his basic presuppositions about the world were completely wrong. And he says that in some way he thinks he actually chose to believe those things because he couldn't deal with the truth, and it made him happier in that way. Now, obviously, we're not saying that everyone who is in an insane asylum chooses to be there. Obviously, there are a lot of other physical conditions that can cause mental disabilities. But we're saying in his case, he specifically says that he, at least on some level, chose that because it made him more happy. So science today wants to believe that there is no God because they can live their lives the way they want to live it. They don't like the thought that they're going to have to face an almighty creator, that they're responsible to him. If they reject him, they will be separated from him forever in hell. And science wants to say that they're right and that everyone else is wrong. So for example, Steven Pinker, one of the most famous naturalists, says most of the traditional causes of belief, faith, revelation, dogma, authority, are generators of error and should be dismissed as sources of knowledge. And he says that the only source of knowledge should be science, and that every other area of life, even areas that beforehand were not considered part of science, should be evaluated by science. Even things like literature or art or other things like that, that science is the only way to know anything. But we have to remember two important truths as we show that science is a wrong way of thinking as well as a wrong way of living, scientism, I should say. The first is that empiricism cannot prove empiricism. Remember, empiricism is the fact that all things have to be proved by our five senses. So remember 2 Corinthians 5 and verse 7 says, "For we walk by faith and not by sight." What it's saying there is that there are some things that we cannot know by our senses. And the problem with empiricism is that it cannot prove itself. Your senses can't verify that your senses are correct. That would be like me using a smoke detector to check to see if that smoke detector works. Well, I cannot use, if the smoke detector is broken, then the smoke detector will not detect smoke. The same thing with my senses. I cannot use my senses to see if my senses work. I cannot use my sense of sight to check to see if my sense of sight works. I cannot use my sense of hearing to see if my sense of hearing works. I can't use logic to see if logic works. So my senses can't verify my senses. Unless I start with the presupposition that my senses work, then I cannot prove empiricism. So like you see there in that little graphic up above, all statements are empirically verifiable except this one. I cannot prove that my senses work using my senses. I have to have an outside source. The problem is if I take away God and revelation, there is no outside source, outside humanity that can prove that our abilities, our evolutionarily developed senses are actually accurate in portraying the world around us and that our logic works. So if something can't be sensed, how can we prove it or disprove it? So again, Pinker says that the only way I have to reject all other forms of revelation of knowledge, only my senses can tell me what is true and false. Well, what about things that can't be sensed? What about, again, going back to morality or God or the spiritual thing or things that we cannot sense with our senses? How can we know that those things exist or don't exist if they cannot be sensed? If the only way to prove things is through our senses, what about things that can't be sensed? So even with the things we can sense, we're still going to have to trust someone. There was a discussion with Richard Dawkins and a couple other people, and they were talking about how the only thing we can trust is things that we can be proven empirically. But the problem is most of what we believe we cannot verify empirically. For example, the coronavirus. Most of us do not have the knowledge or the equipment to even know that there is such thing as a coronavirus. Most of us have never actually seen in a microscope the coronavirus or have seen empirically verified that that virus is actually causing this sickness or that the measures that are being taken actually help with this virus. We have to trust someone else. You can't empirically verify everything you know, so you have to trust someone else. So the question is, who are you going to trust? Are you going to trust other scientists like us who are human and fallen and make mistakes as your ultimate source of authority? Or are you going to trust God as your ultimate source of authority? So empiricism can't prove empiricism. Secondly, there are no brute facts. A brute fact is a fact that doesn't need to be interpreted. So we always have to interpret facts, and we interpret those facts based on our presupposition. Again, a lot of this is review from the first chapter, so I won't take too much time on this. A lot of the evidence of evolution is what we call a just-so story. A just-so story is a story that makes sense as long as you presuppose evolution, but it doesn't give you any evidence that that actually happened. So, for example, they try to explain religion by saying that thousands or millions of years ago, when man first started evolving, they figured out that if they convinced the other people in their group that there was a higher power, it enabled them to work better together and they didn't fight as much, and therefore religion was a tool that was enabled them to work together. They call this group level adaptation. And you say, well, that makes sense. Sure, it makes sense as long as you presuppose evolution. But just because something makes sense doesn't mean it's true. There were so many theories that made sense to Aristotle that when we actually studied them out, we figured out they weren't true. There was no empirical evidence, talking about empiricism, that those just so stories about things that happened in the past that we have no way to verify whether or not that's actually how they came about are true. But many people, just because these things make sense, just because they could have happened, they believe that they did happen. Evolutionary stories about how religion evolved. Another one is hypersensitive to agency. In other words, we see things like lightning, we see things like thunderstorms, and we know that when things happen, something has to cause them. Since we didn't understand the cause for things like lightning or thunderstorms, we said, well, there has to be an agent, so they believed that that agent was a deity. But now that we understand the agency behind those factors, we no longer need to believe in a deity. Well, that makes sense. But again, that presupposes that there is no God when there was no way to prove that empirically, and it's a just so story. There's no way to prove that that's true empirically. C.S. Lewis talks about the fact that he gives in his story of conversion the picture so often painted of Christians huddling together on an ever narrower strip of beach while the incoming tide of science mounts higher and higher corresponds to nothing in my own experience. The grand myth of evolutionary progress is not for me a hostile novelty breaking in on my traditional beliefs. On the contrary, that cosmology is what I started from. Deepening distrust and final abandonment of it long preceded my conversion to Christianity. In other words, what he says, and a lot of scientists say, the more and more people understand science and understand how it's pushing out religion and how it explains all the things that religion tried to explain in a much better way, once you understand that, you will no longer believe religion. C.S. Lewis says it was the opposite for him. When he understood science, the more he understood science, the more he realized the need for those religious presuppositions for science. And instead of science pushing out religion, science actually led him to religion. Why? Because Christianity is the true myth. Now remember, there are two definitions for myth. One is a false story. He's not using the word myth in this sense. He's using the myth in the second sense, which is a way of explaining the world around us. So the Greek myths were ways that the Greeks, using mythology, tried to explain how the world came to be, how the features around them came to be. And C.S. Lewis explains that Christianity is the best explanation for the world around us. It's the true myth. When we really accept what the Bible teaches, that is when we were able to do science in the best way. It's a true story that makes sense of our origin and the world around us. So in that sense, it is a true myth. Finishes up the chapter with a simple statement: any decision to distrust God's word is a decision to trust someone else's. Really, it all comes down to that. Are we willing to trust more our own senses and our own abilities that have failed us so many times in the past and have proven inadequate to explain so much about our life, over trusting what God has revealed in Scripture? That is what scientism wants to do. It wants to say that the best way to explain the world around us is by believing that the only way to understand the world around us is by using our senses and our logic. Christianity says the best way to explain the world around us is by starting with the presuppositions that the Bible teaches is true. That will then make sense of the world, and that will enable us to do correct science, putting science in its place, not as something that gives us ultimate truth, but as something that is workable, that helps us use the world around us to the best of our ability. And that's what we'll talk more about in the final chapter on science.